All right, you're good to go.
Great, thank you. So welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for the Brown Bag webinar on collaborative governance. My name is Chelsea Batavia. I'm a senior environmental scientist, and on behalf of the Delta Science Program, I'm very happy to welcome you to today's webinar. So this is going to be the second of a three-part webinar series with a overarching focus on governance in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. The series overall aims to shed light on the social, political, and institutional dimensions of Delta science and management, helping us think about how institutional structures and processes support effective and equitable environmental management in the Delta. So I'd like to open today's program by inviting our Deputy Executive Director for Science of the Delta Science Program, Dr. Louise Conrad, to say a few words acknowledging the original inhabitants and stewards of the Delta Estuary's lands and waters, whose governance we'll be discussing today. Louise.
Thank you, Chelsea, and welcome everyone. The focus of this Brown Bag series is governance in the Delta. As we engage a discussion around this topic, we must also reckon with the understanding that current institutional arrangements, power structures, and decision-making processes that comprise contemporary governance of the Bay Delta estuary are the product of Western colonial settlement, which displaced the governance systems of Native American peoples who continually occupied, managed, and stewarded the landscape for thousands of years. We acknowledge that the Delta and the larger Bay estuary is located within the ancestral territory of the Native peoples of the numerous villages and tribes of the Bay Miwok, Coast Miwok, Plains Miwok, Maidu, Ohlone, Patwin, Pomo, Wapo, Wintun, and Yokuts, who make up both tribal groups, both recognized and unrecognized. We acknowledge that the Delta Stewardship Council, Delta Science Program, and other organizations represented here today are guests who have benefited from the violent history of colonization, displacement, and dispossession of Native peoples from their traditional homelands. We wish to show our respect to them, their ancestors, and their sovereignty by acknowledging the injustices inherent in this history and their current efforts to achieve restorative justice. We acknowledge the ancestors, elders, and relatives and affirm their sovereign rights as First Peoples. Consistent with the values of community, inclusion, and diversity, it is vitally important that we recognize the land on which we reside is unceded tribal territory, and we acknowledge and support the Native peoples who continue to form a crucial part of the Bay Delta community today. Tribal communities have been stewarding our natural environment since time immemorial. There is much we need to learn from the estuary's tribal communities about responsible stewardship and good governance. Please consider that although this statement acknowledges the ancestral and unceded territories of the original Native peoples of the Bay Delta estuary, additional steps are required to move toward meaningful restorative justice. This series is intended to catalyze our reflection and our dialogue on the distribution of power as it exists today as a legacy of Western colonial settlement, and encourage action supporting tribes in exercising their authority as sovereign governing bodies and the original stewards of the estuary. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Conrad, for laying those important foundations for today's webinar, which I will introduce a little bit now. So as a reminder, for those who may not have attended the first webinar, and that recording is available online now, I'll share the link in the chat in a second. Each webinar in this series focuses on a different social scientific framework that can be used to understand Delta governance. The framework for today's panel is collaborative governance. In general, I tend to think of this framework centering the processes of coordination and cooperation that occur through networks, partnerships, and other collaborative forums on Delta governance. I also think about collaborative governance highlighting not only the formal or centralized processes like legislative or regulatory processes, but also less formal or decentralized processes through which decisions may be shaped or made by organizations and individuals from across sectors, such as government, NGOs, community organizers, and activists, and private industry. I'm not going to say more now because you're going to get to hear from the experts in just a minute, but I will briefly provide a roadmap of today's webinar. I'll be moderating alongside my colleague, Brandon Chapin, who's also providing our Zoom support. I'd like to thank Brandon for his help today. And I also want to acknowledge my webinar series co-organizers, Lauren Hastings, Jessica Rednick, and Jenica Moffett. So for today, for the first hour, we'll hear presentations from each panelist, and then the rest of the time will be spent in facilitated panel discussion. For those of you who did attend the first webinar, you may remember we ran out of time for discussion. We learned from that experience, and so this time I will be much more attentive to timekeeping to ensure that we do have plenty of time for discussion. We have a couple questions prepared for that portion of the webinar, but we'll also definitely be accepting your questions from the audience. So please submit those using the QA feature on Zoom, and the chat is also available. We also invite you to use the chat feature to comment throughout the presentation and talk with the other attendees and panelists. With that, we will move into our first presentation by Dr. Andrea Gerlak, who's an associate professor in the School of Geography and Development and an associate research professor at the Udall Center for Studies in Public Policy at the University of Arizona. Dr. Gerlak's research agenda focuses on cooperation and conflict in water governance, including questions of equity and access, institutional change, learning, and adaptation. She's an author or co-author of over 100 publications and has 2 decades of experience leading interdisciplinary environmental studies programs and university community environmental partnerships. She's consulted on water governance and climate resilience efforts for UNESCO and the WMO. I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Gerlak.
Thanks. I'm really pleased to be here. Thanks for that kind introduction. And I'm going to see if I can get my slides going here. Let's see, did that work? Great, perfect. Can you all see that okay and hear me okay?
Yes, looks great.
Okay, I'm going to get going. I know we're short for time. Well, I'm really happy to kick off our webinar, our session here today. Let me minimize this so you don't see that. I'm hoping that I can build and grow from your earlier webinar last month on environmental governance. And the aim really for today is to share with you how social scientists are studying collaborative governance and how this work hopefully can help better inform the really important work that all of you are doing in the Bay Delta. So just let's start by providing a little bit of context about what we mean by collaborative governance, how it came about, and then I'll jump into like what we actually know about how it works, key challenges, these sorts of things. Well, Chelsea started us off thinking about what she thinks about when she thinks about collaborative governance. And this is a really widely recognized definition here on the slide by Emerson and Nabachi. And they talk about collaborative governance as the processes and the structures of how these public policy decisions are made and managed. You can see part of their definition is about engaging people across boundaries of public agencies, levels of government. So you have kind of public-private spheres, and the whole idea is about carrying out a public purpose that couldn't otherwise be accomplished. So the function of collaborative governance is really to address collective action problems that cross multiple jurisdictions and functional boundaries. Collaboration is different from cooperation and coordination. It suggests a much closer relationship. It entails often new structures, shared resources, defined relationships, communication. What distinguishes collaborative governance, I think, from governance more broadly, or even environmental governance that Mark Lubell talked about at your session, the webinar session last month, is that collaborative governance is really focused on this process, and it's very much about partnerships. It crosses government, private sector, and kind of the non-governmental or the civil society sphere. Well, what explains the rise in collaborative governance? Collaborative, kind of this modern idea of collaborative governance that we're in today, it's certainly with respect to kind of environmental protection and restoration work and collaboration, is really about 3 decades old now, kind of from the late 1980s into the early 1990s. And it can be explained by this kind of multiplication of administrative partners, just more government actors playing a role. This proliferation of political influence outside government circles, so private sector actors wanting to be more involved, but also civil society demanding more of a role. This idea that we weren't doing really well with representative democracy, and certainly around conflict, resolving conflicts over public policy, kind of a stalemate around environmental policy really kind of dating back to the 1980s. And then on a more positive note, collaborative governance is a response to more of to this kind of recognition that we have deeper understandings of ecosystems and interdependencies, and we can't manage them by land, water, air, but rather recognizing kind of these interdependencies and these linkages. When I teach collaborative governance to my students, undergrads and grad students, I talk often about the Reagan era, and really, collaborative governance is kind of almost a response to the politics of the Reagan administration in the 1980s. And the retreat of government really helps explain the shift in governance towards a more collaborative governance structure or set of processes as federal money declined and investment declined and federal participation declined, and maybe even kind of rules around a lot of public policy areas. There was a vacuum there in the private sector and the public sector in terms of kind of more civil society or non-governmental actors really filled that vacuum. And this is just a snapshot of like two big examples of this on kind of the environmental sphere. We see the Missouri River Recovery Program on the left, Everglades on the right. And in the 1990s, under Clinton and then Secretary of the Interior Babbitt, we see a push for ecosystem restoration and management. In part, it's a response to a lot of the violations and conflicts with the Clean Water Act and the Endangered Species Act and these perceived obstacles to collaboration. And we, of course, we all know the history in Bay Delta, and the Babbitt administration certainly played a role in creating new institutional structures and bringing collaborative governance really in many ways to the Bay Delta. And this is just an image of what these like new structures and new venues look like. So this is just a snapshot of in Florida for the Everglades. This is kind of the restoration task force and the kind of the program that the Southern Florida Everglades Restoration Program. It's kind of a visual to show how all these different actors come together. So it's the same set of actors who've been playing a role: federal agencies, state agencies, local agencies, tribes, nonprofits, but they've been coming together since the 1990s in these new forums and these new venues, and everything from implementation to delivery to kind of science teams. And this is just a snapshot of a collaborative governance graduate certificate program we have at the University of Arizona. And I show it not to advertise, I show it to really try to communicate with you this growth in the study and practice of collaborative governance, such that we have a certificate program now for graduate students in a whole bunch of different disciplines to take. It really shows that collaborative governance is a well-established area of study. And it's not just for the environment. We do healthcare now in this kind of collaborative governance approach. We manage our prisons this way. We manage how we pick up trash and collect our trash. So collaborative governance really is how we do public policy in so many realms of public policy, not just the environment. Well, let's get going. What do we know about social science research and collaborative governance? What I hope to do with the rest of this talk is draw key lessons, key findings from this broad scholarship. So I mostly tried to pull from environmental cases and environmental research, but there's, as I mentioned, there's good collaborative governance scholarship in lots of other areas. So I tried to kind of pick broadly. I looked at journal articles, I looked at books, and these are the kinds of questions broadly that researchers are looking at. They're trying to understand why collaborative governance structures or processes started in particular cases, how they're structured or what their institutional design process, what are those mechanisms for engaging. Some people focus just on the agencies themselves and what that coordination looks like. Some researchers have really been trying to focus on the power dynamics and better understand power inequities and how those are managed, and then some research on outcomes as well. So let's talk about the promise of collaborative governance. This is what we've been thinking collaborative governance can do on the left-hand side here: reduce transaction costs, facilitate better decision-making, address these kind of interrelated problems that we certainly see around the environment. That collaborative governance could give greater legitimacy, can improve implementation, hopefully to reduce or mitigate conflict. And then over on so these are the goals, the promise of collaborative governance on the left. And on the right on this slide, what I've tried to do is just do a little snapshot of some of these indicators of the outcomes. So this is what researchers are looking for to see if that promise has been met, to see how collaborative governance regimes or structures or venues or processes are meeting these goals. And so they look at how public values are incorporated, or if conflict has been reduced, or if trust has been built. And a lot of this is done through surveys, interviews, focus groups, these sorts of things, to understand people's perceptions, or to look at the decision-making that occurs in collaborative governance processes to better understand if these outcomes have been met. Well, what do we know about performance? We have these promises about performance. We have these ways that researchers study it. Well, what do we know? Well, there's really good research on the variables that affect the performance of collaborative governance. And I tried to simplify it in kind of with 3 points. First, we know across a broad set of papers and research that it's important to get the people right. And by this, I mean that you're bringing the people with the right expertise together, with the resources, with the knowledge, the people who are affected by the decisions that will be made by the collaborative structure. And we know that exclusions of key people or particular forms of knowledge can compromise a process and compromise collaborative governance processes. The second key finding that we know about performance is that the commitment by government agencies is really key. It's funding, but it's leadership, it's expertise. And again, what we know from the research is that if agency culture works against this, or agency practices kind of dilute or diminish the kind of government's role, that really can compromise what's at play with collaborative governance. And then the process matters, but I want to just kind of put a pin in that for a second. I'm going to come back to that before we talk about process a little bit more, because this is really where there's so much rich scholarship. I just want to say a word about performance and environmental outcomes. We know from a lot of the research that collaborative governance has a positive effect on the perceived policy or program effectiveness. And we know that there is some really good evidence about stakeholder cooperation and consensus through collaborative governance. There's this promise also that collaborative governance will lead to improved environmental outcomes, right? I mean, we're doing all of this at the end of the day because we want to make a particular ecosystem healthier or stronger or more resilient. The evidence here is is really more in its infancy. There is some evidence from a set of cases that collaborative governance processes lead to greater environmental and improved environmental outcomes, but there's a lot of challenges with doing this kind of research. There's a lot of time lags involved. Process in terms of collaborative governance. So I'm going to spend a bit more time talking with you about process. These are a set of findings that I distilled from a lot of different research and cases about what a good collaborative governance process looks like. Face-to-face dialogue, an open and inclusive process where lots of diverse ways of knowing are incorporated, where there's broad participation. Researchers talk about the importance of clear ground rules and transparency about how the process works, access to meeting minutes, clear agendas, these sorts of things. Deadlines, lots of research about how deadlines can help provide accountability, the role of field trips in building community, knowledge, trust, and mechanisms to support learning, mechanisms where actors can reflect on decisions that were made, reports that were written, meetings that were held, to be more adaptive, to change, to learn from them, to make better decisions going forward. I want to call out and spend a little bit more time about sustained dialogue, because this is something that, I don't think I found a paper that didn't talk about it. This is the notion that you're bringing folks together, you're having conversation, it's iterative, it's sustained, it's not a one-off. And the reason for the dialogue is to have this exchange of viewpoints, to have an atmosphere where that supports mutual respect, civility. It's about trying to achieve mutual understanding. Even if you don't get consensus, it's about trying to hear and listen to others, doing so in a neutral space or a forum. And again, characterized by this notion of listening, learning, being deliberative. I started the talk with the definition of collaborative governance by Emerson and Nabachi, and they have this really well-known book, well-referenced book on collaborative governance. What they did is they created this framework there on the left. They read all sorts of research, empirical findings, theoretical findings, and they kind of did a really kind of synthetic look about collaborative governance. And what I would like to focus on is that middle, that collaboration dynamics, the principled engagement, the joint capacity, and the shared motivation. And what they write about in their work is that it's these dynamics work together, like how you're bringing people together, how they pool their resources, their understanding, their knowledge, their science together, how you grow and build this shared motivation. Those all work together. They almost talk about them like gears and how they all come together and work together. So one thing I pull this out because I really want to make sure I communicate that collaborative governance scholars aren't thinking about process and collaborative governance as like a check sheet where it's like, check, got that, check, got that. They do think about it that way. Like, are you writing clear agendas, and are you meeting in a unbiased place or space? Are you creating venues and forums where people feel free to speak their mind? It is a little bit of like checkbox for that, but really it's very much about how these different factors come together to reinforce one another to create a dynamic that is positive and intentional and adaptive. So it isn't just putting processes or structures in place one by one, but it's thinking about this larger dynamic. Of course, there's challenges. There's not a single paper that I read that said, hey, you know, we set this up, everything worked right, you know, we're a model, follow us. You know, every paper is really littered with, you know, challenges, things that didn't quite work. It's everything from conflicting agency goals to administrative or legal procedures that really just work against a collaborative process, not having enough money or the resources or the science that you need, making sure you keep a process open and inclusive over time, and then really the training of folks about how to listen, how to talk, how to resolve disputes, how to negotiate. This leads me to my last slide, which is about practitioner challenges. There's some new research around what practitioners need, what kind of skills they need, and it's this coordination, negotiation, persuasion, how to manage complex networks of actors, how to rely on these interpersonal skills, but also interorganizational processes, working within your network and outside your network, how to use technology, how to think about performance management effectively, how to have really good transparency in decision-making, and how to keep being creative and in how you craft different channels for citizens to participate. I think I'll stop there. I'm happy to share my slides, and I have 2 pages of references of key papers. And if anyone wanted to email me, I would be really pleased to share the PDFs of these papers as well. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gerlak. That was fantastic. And thank you for correcting and refining my vague understanding of collaborative governance straight from the mouth of the expert. That was really great. Thank you so much. If you do have questions, please pop them in the chat. We'll circle back to some questions at the end, but for now, we're going to move on to our next speaker, Jessica Law, who is the Executive Director of the Sacramento Water Forum. So the Sacramento Water Forum brings together diverse interests focused on balancing 2 co-equal objectives, providing a reliable and safe water supply for the region's economic health and planned development through the year 2030, and preserving the fishery, wildlife, recreational, and aesthetic values of the Lower American River. With more than 15 years of water and environmental resource management experience, Jessica is passionate about building long-term solutions to California's complex natural resource challenges. She's worked with experts in water management, fisheries biology, ecosystem restoration, engineering, environmental law, and economics to guide decisions on complex projects and programs throughout the state. Previously, Jessica served as Chief Deputy Executive Officer of the Delta Stewardship Council. She holds a bachelor's degree in biology, focused on ecology from Connecticut College, and a master's in regional planning from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Please join me in welcoming Jessica Law.
Thanks so much, Chelsea. It's great to be here and to be back. I can't wait to see all of you in person again. And Dr. Gerlak, thank you for that overview presentation. My background is in regional planning, and I can't tell you how much this position at the Water Forum and really the role of the Water Forum, it's a really fascinating case study and example on how to do collaborative governance. And so thank you, Dr. Gerlak. Some of that theory is great. I took a ton of notes, and I'm looking forward to having a conversation today about this. So for those of you who are maybe familiar, maybe not familiar with the Water Forum, what I'll do today is just talk a little bit about what we do, sort of our main practice areas and program areas. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more about what we're diving into this year, which is a renegotiation of the Water Forum's original agreement. And I'll talk about that process a little bit and how interest-based negotiation played a role in development of that agreement, and then what collaborative governance looks like for us now. Let's see. Okay. All right. So the Water Forum has two co-equal objectives. For those of you at the Stewardship Council, this might look a little bit familiar, but the Water Forum Agreement, which was signed in 2000, is focused on these two co-equal objectives: to provide a reliable and safe water supply for the region's economic health and planned development to the year 2030, and to preserve the fishery, wildlife, recreation, and aesthetic values of the Lower American River. This is not just our goal or mission, this is really our mantra every single day. We think about this, we talk about this, and it's very much a part of our conversation and what we do as a Water Forum when we come together. I want to talk a little bit about the programs that we have, and I wrote down a few things, which was, sort of what's the secret sauce or the magic of collaborative governance. And there's a few things actually on this slide that I think are representative of that. So face-to-face interaction, we don't always get to do that, or we haven't been able to do that a lot in the past 2 years, obviously with COVID. But here we are with groups of people out at Ansel Hoffman Park last year. We did a big restoration project there, and it was really an amazing opportunity to get together face to face, to build relationships. The picture here in the middle with Kent Anderson, who's the executive director of the FEO Nature Center, and Secretary Crowfoot. He came out to learn about the project. We've got our environmental caucus members here, along with our program manager, Erica Bishop, looking at the site, talking about the site design. We ended up making modifications based on that process, or this field trip. And then here we are doing construction. The crew that constructs the Water Forum projects is an amazing collaboration between City of Sacramento, Department of Utilities, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Bureau of Reclamation. And there's so much history and collaboration here that's really making our project successful. And then we did a bunch of educational outreach as well with the FEO Nature Center, and then Erica Bishop again doing some of the monitoring on site. So the Water Forum has had a restoration program for about the past 10 years. Most of our funding is through the Central Valley Improvement Act, CVPIA. We also have some state funding through Prop 68. The main focus of our restoration is for cell-mounted restoration. We move a lot of gravel around to produce spawning habitat and rearing habitat. So this project at FEO is just our most recent example. It's one of the bigger projects, and it's one of the projects where we really had an opportunity to engage with the community, to engage with FEO Nature Center, and really start to build some partnerships there, and also with Sac County Regional Parks. So that was last year. And we have 2 more projects coming up this year. And then several more projects. We're pursuing a programmatic permit for 10 sites along the American River. That programmatic should be completed pretty soon. And a lot of these projects will be funded continually through CVPIA and state funding, and hopefully will support the voluntary agreement process that's negotiating. So again, all of our, there is a lot of regulatory framework for the work that we do, but this is really what it looks like when this regulatory framework comes together. Okay, so some of our partners for habitat enhancement. I've put 2 of our consulting firms on here because I Seebeck and Kramer Fish Sciences. I want to give them a shout out because they have been such an integral part of this partnership. And if we're talking about collaborative governance, it's not always just state, federal, local private. There's also sort of the private and the nonprofit aspect of it as well. And I'm seeing this as we go through our work on habitat restoration, just how critical those partnerships are, whether it's public, private, state or federal, or sort of all of these entities together. Okay, so the other half of what we do, or I'd say maybe the other third of what we do, is really focusing on flows and operations out of Folsom Reservoir and down the Lower American River. So many of you, I'm sure, play along the Lower American River and on the Parkway. And if you're out there a lot, you'll see how much the water levels change throughout the year. If you were out there last year during the summer, you would see what you can see here on this graph, which is water temperatures were extremely high. They were at around, this was one of our earlier sort of iterations and modeling iterations of what temperatures we were aiming to get on the river. But throughout the entire summer, the temperatures were really warm, and then which really impacts salmon spawning and health of juveniles in the river. This work, it's hard to kind of compact all of this work onto a single slide, but the Water Forum has worked over the past 15 years, I'd say, to pull together a flow management standard that balances both the water supply and the fisheries aspect, or the health of the fisheries in the Lower American River. It's a very technical document. We call it the Modified Flow Management Standard. It's modified because it's gone through several iterations. And currently it's incorporated in the 2019 biological opinion for reclamation, which means it's the work of the Water Forum that was developed by a lot of these technical consultants, city county entities coming together. This work is then incorporated in a federal regulation or a federal document that's regulating flows. And as a result, the last 2 years, reclamation has been operating to the Modified Flow Management Standard, which means the Water Forum is still very active and very engaged at the table with Bureau of Reclamation, National Marine Fisheries Service, CDFW, at the table working through what operations look like on, sometimes almost a daily or weekly basis, especially at this time of year. And so there's a lot of science, obviously, that goes into this, but there's a lot of modeling work, and there's really a very, very strong focus on temperature. Temperature is the main lever that can be controlled through either storing additional water in Folsom Reservoir and then also releasing it at certain times of year to make sure that you're protecting the salmonids in the river. So this work has been it's been really interesting for me to see sort of how literally the wheels and the power turbines are churning on the river, and what that means for fish in the river. But this is, I'd say, another really strong focus. Obviously, last year we were in a drought, and this year again we're in a drought, and so some really difficult decisions need to be made. But I'd say the Water Forum has been doing a good job being at the table and trying to help as much as possible support these decisions. So those are sort of our two major programs. In terms of our strategic objectives, this is just a short summary of what we will be doing this year and in future years. But to the extent that a lot of our work, and this is where I want to draw attention, a lot of our work is about maintaining strong coordination, coordination, collaboration, connections. This is just such an integral part of the work that we do. We do not work, there's no Water Forum working alone. Water Forum is only existing because of these relationships between local, state, and federal agencies, and then all of the caucuses that are in the Water Forum. Okay, so let me focus a little bit more on our big challenge ahead. So the Water Forum started back in, the agreement was signed in 2000, but it was really the result of some intense negotiations in the region over conflicts. Conflicts over Auburn Dam, conflicts over additional diversions from the American River. And as a result, the agreement itself, it took 7 years to negotiate. It used an interest-based negotiation structure, and which has sort of individual caucuses and then sort of that's what sets the negotiation table. And then they were coming together and working through those agreements. We are still within the timeframe of the existing agreement. It goes until 2030. But because the first one took 7 years, we are taking the time now to renegotiate the agreement. So let me talk a little bit about Water Forum 2.0 and sort of what the main topics are. But I also want to touch on the governance component of this as well. So interest-based negotiation, these are sort of the main principles of the work within interest-based negotiation. And this is an excerpt, or these are, I guess, sort of the main points from a book, Getting to Yes. Many of you have seen that book or read that book, but these points here, the principles of our work, are not just bullet points on a slide. We talk about this every single day. So separating the people from the problem, focusing on interests rather than positions, generating varieties of options before settling on agreements, and insisting that the agreement be based on objective criteria. These principles are present in pretty much all of our conversations, in all of our work with the caucuses, either within them or caucus to caucus, those discussions. And it's really, this is sort of our secret sauce. This is the way that we continue to come together in a collaborative and a productive way. These principles are really important to our work. So I started at the Water Forum of January, not January 2022, but January 2021. And the Water Forum 2.0 process, at that point, there was some work that had been done to set a foundation in terms of foundational learning. But we really hadn't kicked into gear yet in terms of laying the different pieces for the Water Forum agreement process. And Dr. Gerlak was talking about process. I have found that to be so true with this group, that we really need to be very, very clear on what our process is and how we get from point A to point B to point C. So these are the major building blocks that we laid out last year, focusing on desired outcomes and key management questions. That was a huge first step. What are we doing? Why are we doing this? What are major outcomes that we're looking for? Bringing together a new caucus, a public caucus, talking with the water districts that have been involved for a long time. What's important to them? What are they looking for? What's sort of the longstanding agreement that they're going for? And then talking a lot about core interests and issues. And then kicking into technical analysis. So that's really what we accomplished last year. This is a bit more of a detailed kind of list of what that is. Again, though, it's really sort of, making progress on making sure that we have the right people at the table. The people that are at the table understand where we're going with this, what our desired outcomes are, what our core questions are. And then as you have the caucuses coming to the table, they're gathering together and really understanding what their interests are as a caucus. So not positions, but interests, and then how those interests align within the caucus and amongst the different caucuses. So let me skip forward. So I just want to talk a little bit about core interests and issues, because I've been saying that word a lot. What are the interests? And this was a result of a very detailed analysis that we did for each of the caucuses. These are the main issues and interests that are coming up in the Water Forum 2.0 process. I don't think any of them are surprising necessarily, but this is really the scope of where we're trying to head. Reconfirming that the co-equal objectives is our main focus for the work that we're doing. Thinking about climate change resiliency, I can't tell you how much this keeps coming up over and over again. This is really either our common enemy or our common goal or objective moving forward is to take the co-equal objectives and think about climate resiliency. Regional context and representation. Who are we? What's our role? What's our legacy? And what's our scale of engagement? Does that need to be broadened, whether geographically or in terms of other stakeholders at the table? What does that look like, and how do we do that well? And then the other aspects are more sort of the topics, thinking about long-range planning, water conservation, water efficiency, and then groundwater conjunctive use in the region. All of these need to be linked back to objectives, sort of quantitative objectives. What are we trying to achieve in each of these areas? And that's really where we are right now, where the caucuses are starting to dig into these a bit more and say, you know, when we think about water conservation and efficiency in the region, is it enough to just implement new state regulations? Do we need to do 5%, 10%, 20% more than that? And if so, what does that look like for resiliency? Okay, let me go back just one. So this is sort of where we're going in the process. Again, foundational work that we've had that we really completed last year, thinking about our assumptions, really solidifying our structure, thinking about the principles of our work, and just doing a ton of learning and engagement. And then our phase one, again, reconfirming co-equal objectives, starting to work through those core interests and objectives, thinking about our desired outcomes, our key management, and then getting into that initial analysis. Where we are now in phase two is kind of a pivot. We still need to continue to do learning and engagement. We understand areas of emerging areas of agreement, but what does that divergence look like and where are there some solutions? So I think I'm going to leave it, Chelsea, to you. Sorry, there's so much to tell in terms of a story here, but I'll leave you here, which is, you know, the Water Forum is really trying to pivot as an organization, maintaining this foundation on interest-based negotiation, what that looks like, and using it to adapt and think about climate change resiliency. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessica, and I apologize for popping on. I'm trying to be strict about my timekeeping today, but that was so interesting. And like the interest-based negotiation and the caucus approach is just fascinating to me. So I am looking forward to digging in more in the discussion. You do have a couple questions, one in the chat and one in the QA box. If you'd like to answer those, please feel free, or we can circle back to them at the end. For now, we will move on to our next speaker, who is Matthew Moore. Matthew Moore is the United Auburn Indian Community's Tribal Historic Preservation Officer. He's a retired firefighter and paramedic. Matt is passionate about native plants, traditional burning, and bringing traditional ecological knowledge into the larger community. We're so happy to welcome Matthew Moore.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me. So yeah, I'm Matthew Moore. I go by Tippo most of the time just because it's a lot easier to say. So when you hear me say Tippo, that's what I'm referring to. Throughout the country, we kind of use that. It's kind of understood between the agencies. So I'm not trying to cut corners or anything, but so I go by Tippo instead of Tribal Historic Preservation Officer most of the time. But for United Auburn Indian Community, who I am also a tribal member, we have a Tribal Historic Preservation Department as well as the Tippo. So with our, and you can go ahead and go to the next slide, please. And with United Auburn, we are a sovereign government. We are made up of Nisenan Maidu, which is Southern Maidu, and Miwok. We're located just outside of Auburn in Placer County. So when we, our structure, which is not exactly like every other tribe in the state or the country, each one's designed and set up a little bit differently. So when you do reach out to tribes, just understand that some of them operate slightly different than others. But our structure is, we do have a tribal council. Consists of 5 individuals, all tribal members. From there, we have a Tribal Historic Preservation Committee, where there's a chairman and 4 members. Again, all tribal members. The Tribal Historic Preservation Officer is myself, or the Tippo. And then from there, we have the department in which we have a director, Rebecca Allen, director of our preservation department. And we have staff in which we have our department kind of broken up into 2 categories, tribal heritage and the regulatory process. So we have individuals that receive consultation letters, review them, and get those out to the appropriate individuals to follow up. And then we have the tribal heritage side, where we have people that are specialized in traditional ecological knowledge, history, customs, all our knowledge and skills in as far as, how did we interact with the land and our landscape, what differences that our people had on on our lands and the ecosystem when they were here before contact. Next slide, please. Okay, United Auburn's traditional area consists of several counties, as far up as like around Plumas County, down towards El Dorado County, from the Sierra Nevadas down to the Valley floor. The Sacramento River was typically in the feather, or kind of the western boundaries, I guess. So we have northern Maidu, southern Maidu, which is Nissan, or the northern Maidu, actually they call them mountain Maidu. We have valley Maidu, and then Concow. So basically, when we collaborate and consult, we're really consulting and collaborating with several entities from federal agencies, which we consult with over 20, over 15 state agencies, 11 counties, 20 plus cities and towns, and then of course 25 plus utility districts. We also like to collaborate with NGOs, universities, community colleges, and other tribes, of course. We do really find that when we collaborate with the other tribes that we get a lot more progress when it comes to consulting on larger projects that might overlap with other tribal communities. Next slide, please. So how does United Auburn approach collaboration? In our viewpoint, in our ways, environmental is cultural and cultural is spiritual. We always talk about when we consult or collaborate, it's usually over natural resources, whether it's the feds or the state or locals. And we always try to say that, all resources are cultural. So when we talk about specific resources, we don't see a difference between modern resources, I guess you can say, and cultural, because they're all the same. And in our world, it's one of the reasons we're put here is to, I guess, tend to those resources to ensure the health of the future health, not just to the ecosystem, but for the people. Kinships and guardianships, I mean, these are really all about the relationship between the people and their communities and the land itself. And that is typically referred to as stewardship. That's something that at least I look at as something that we used to be able to do. We don't have the ability to steward anymore because we don't have the lands. Our native landscapes are, they were prohibited from doing certain activities at one point. Laws were changed. A lot of things that we did were outlawed. So the stewardship went away. And then this new kind of management style of the land came about with colonization. And once the native hands were taken away from native lands, and that's when you really see the degradation of cultural resources and the health of our ecosystem. Historic and contemporary cultural relationships, like I mentioned, it was really our relationship with the land and our relationship with the other communities and how we went about our seasonal activities. And these are all related to putting back our work and hard labor back into the land, so that through the seasons we're ensuring that we have healthy crops in spring and summer. So a lot of the activities would be in the fall, let's say, and many of these were family and community events. So it was really kind of that tie to nature that they always believed in. And as far as future cultural relationships, I think we're finding ourselves now more as like being guardians and trying to rehabilitate the land so that we can get it back to a state where we can steward and tend to the land. But I think when it comes to resources, I mean, like I mentioned, everything's cultural resources, and all these varying resources that get kind of segregated. For us, it's all connected and they're all one and the same. Without one, you don't have the other. If you don't take care of one, you're not going to have the other in the future for healthier people and survival in general. But I think one of the biggest messages that we try to spread is that we are still here and we still have that connection. And we want to have that ability to access the lands once again so that we can put some attention back into the landscape. And we had kind of a family saying that Nisenan lands belong in Nisenan hands. And I find that to be pretty true because we have the knowledge, we have that connectivity to the past, and we've seen the changes occur over the decades. And I think when we refer to our technology, our traditional ecological knowledge, it really proves that, and even science nowadays is showing that our indigenous technologies were very strong and in depth. And they're realizing that those are the things that we need to start doing once again. So what does that lead us to now? I mean, I think it's really about educating the public and the agencies, all our partners that we collaborate with. And I think it's that early consultation leads to collaboration oftentimes with what we find. And a lot of the consultation is regulatory driven, but a lot of our collaboration comes from consultation sometimes, or it might lead to another group of individuals that are have the same interests, and then we can form a relationship and a partnership and then collaborate. I think without the collaboration, we really need to start dropping the hard boundaries and us and them, and how do we get through this with you can't do it all on our own. I mean, as far as tribes, we can't do this alone, so it's going to take the partnerships and the collaboration moving forward for all of us. I think we're all here together, so we need to figure this out together. Next, please. So the collaborations around the Delta were pretty vast. We've done a lot of infrastructure work throughout the region. Some of them, the most important ones are levees, which surround a lot of the communities in the flood zones. But with these levees, what you have is, which are always located along waterways, of course, that's what makes it a levee. What you find are, these are all a series of villages all up and down our waterways, from the main rivers all the way up into the tributaries, into the ravines, all the way up into the hills where, the watersheds were usually the places where we lived. And anytime you enter those areas, you're going to find evidence of indigenous habitation, even modern habitation, because we're still here. But what they did at the levees is they really built upon village site and basically connected the dots all up and down the waterways. And in doing so, they either covered up or destroyed who knows how many villages that were there. But it was quite a project, and a lot of work and effort went into that, and not always the best consultation, but over time we just demanding that we had to be at the table, and through that we were able to figure things out. And as far as avoidance or how to reduce the effects of some of these projects, we're also looking at tribal beneficial uses. Like I kind of alluded to, we don't have access to lands that we used to. We don't hold large amounts of tribal lands. that we can benefit from. A lot of times we're sitting with lands that were basically just handed to us, and this is where you get to live, and that's it. The rest is kind of off limits, and they call those reservations or rancherias here in California. We still have many members living on our rancheria today. But it's really about us getting back out and having access. And I think that's going to happen through collaboration and consultation. I think more agencies are willing to listen and see the benefits of letting tribal people come out and just being on their land, because I think really they're the ones that know how to steward and tend to when it comes to the health of our landscapes, when it comes to the invasive plant communities taking over the native plant communities. We know how to maintain the indigenous plant species through the use of cultural fire. And I think with that, it eradicates all the invasives. It reduces the competition between plant communities, which ultimately that has a lot of effect on our water and how the water comes off our hills and into our waterways. Which also, it comes to water quality. Cultural burning also helped improve not just the soil health, but the indigenous plant communities relied upon that burning process. They're very fire adaptive, and in the long run, that carbon sequestration has so many benefits all the way down into the waterways that actually help improve the water by cleaning it. The charcoal actually would absorb impurities, which helps clean the water. So it's not just, one process, is really just multitudes of benefits for multiple species, and not just humans and plants that they consumed or used for medicine. It was all the other species that were, like I said, everything's tied together. So the health of one community leads to the health of others. Intertribal collaboration, we do a lot of work with other tribes in our area. We are one of the few federally recognized tribes. That's probably why we do so much work abroad throughout our, our Aboriginal territories, because we're really there to help other tribes at the same time. So we might seem like we cover a lot of area, but we're really there to support our neighboring tribal communities, which don't always have the staffing or the capabilities to do what we do, because we have a fairly decent sized department, and we are better equipped to take on multiple projects. So yeah, we're always working with each other and looking for ways to move ahead and improve things with agencies as far as consultation and the collaboration. For access and gathering, that goes right back to where I was saying that we just don't have access anymore. California is primarily private land, and even when you do have some access to public land, it's usually not favorable for what we're pursuing, which is gathering food sources or medicines. And we just can't do that because our environment's so unhealthy that our food sources and medicines are really suffering. So particularly when it comes to the basket makers, they have a hard time. They struggle because these basketry materials really heavily rely upon fire to keep them in a state where they produce the material that they can actually use. What you see now, when you look around, we might see native plant communities, but they're not healthy, and their materials are practically unusable because they haven't been tended to. So that's kind of where we're coming from when it comes to just the collaborations and consultations, which leads to hopefully more positive things in the future, and then moving forward with the agencies in a more efficient way too, as we gain relationships and trust. I mean, a lot of it's just trust building between the two. Next slide, please. Okay. So what we're always trying to shoot for is how do we make projects better? Traditional ecological knowledge comes up quite often when it comes to when somebody comes to us with a particular project, and hopefully they do so early on. We always advocate for early consultation, especially say in the planning stages, or even if it's like a feasibility study. We have a lot of information and knowledge on things that people don't really realize, and it's not just looking it up online and cherry picking information. There's a lot more to it than that, and a lot more background that we can provide to agencies and groups when it comes to if they're planning on a project, which for us, that really leads to avoidance of our sensitive sites, of our cemeteries, of our gathering areas, or hunting, fishing areas, so that we can protect those and ensure those for the future generations. So we really are trying to change the perspective for agencies when it comes to landscape values. When they look at projects and say going through the NEPA or CEQA process, it really gets categorized, and things are broken down to where it's just like for our values, they just don't fit. And it's like putting a round peg in a square hole. They just don't line up right. But once agencies start to understand our values and how that looks, they kind of start to understand. It's like, okay, now it's making sense where the sticking point is between the two. And hopefully we can make changes to get around that and move along together. And because not all projects usually end up with favorable outcomes for tribes. And they like to talk about mitigation, for instance, early on. And that to me is a huge red flag. Mitigation for me in my world is something that we lost something, and this is kind of the Band-Aid to make you feel better, which means we lost something. And, for me, that's not acceptable. Their mitigation really usually doesn't nearly cover the effects and the negative effects or poor outcomes that we experience.
Yeah. I truly apologize for interrupting you, because this is all so important to hear. But if you're able to wrap up in the next minute or so.
I think this is a last.
Great, thank you. I'm sorry about that.
Oh, no problem. So yeah, so I mean, this early consultation and collaboration really in the long run saves agencies money. They're not having to go back and redo plans or redesign, or have to waste a lot of time and money fixing things. So in what we've seen, that's really been very true. And agencies are usually happier in the outcome. But like I mentioned, mitigation and impacts of cultural sites. It's the past is always ask for forgiveness and instead of permission. Well, it's if you're there early enough, and you don't need to ask for forgiveness, because we can figure these things out together, and and just have a better product and the outcome, and everybody's happy. And then some things that we can live with, and know that we didn't destroy, we protected, and all sides are happy, and these form really good relationships over time. And as you see, even in consultation, it really helps kind of make that more efficient too. And I think that was the last slide. Yep. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matt. And again, I wish we could spend 2 hours together.
Yeah, it's a short time.
Well, thank you. That was really illuminating, and just really interesting to hear different pieces linking back to what we heard from Andrea at the beginning, and then connections to what Jessica said, but also very different facets of collaboration. So looking forward to circling back. And I also appreciate learning the acronym Tippo. For now, we will move on to our final speaker, Brett Milligan. who is a professor of landscape architecture and environmental design at the University of California, Davis. So Brett's a founding member of the Dredge Research Collaborative, a nonprofit dedicated to exploring the human alteration and design of sedimentary processes and landscapes. And at UC Davis, the director of Metamorphic Landscapes, a research lab prototyping adaptation techniques to conditions of accelerated climatic and environmental change. His research approach is transdisciplinary, exploring ways to build adaptive capacity across disciplines and publics through design, research, participatory design practices, landscape ethnography, and fieldwork. His recent projects include the Frank's Tract Futures and Delta Island adaptations in the California Delta and the Public Sediment Team's Unlock Alameda Creek for the Bay Area Resilient by Design competition. Please help me in welcoming Brett.
Thank you. Hope you can hear me okay. Greetings, everyone. Yeah, in the interest of time, I'm going to go quick here. What I'd like to do is a lot of what I'm going to say, hopefully, I think builds off all the great presentations that have come before mine, and hopefully this maybe reinforces some of what they've said. I'm going to talk about Frank's Tract Futures, which is, I think, can be seen as an example of collaborative governance. And I'm going to focus on process. As we've heard, process really matters. And I'm going to talk about co-design as a potential form of collaborative governance. So if that term's new to you, collaborative design or co-design can mean the collaborative problem solving and innovation outcomes achieved through an inclusive and equitable design process. The co-design is collaborative design, and it's collaborative in the sense of involving all who might be affected by a plan or a design. Collaborative in terms of integrating knowledge and expertise from a range of experts, as well as local knowledge, the people who live there. So in that way, it is both public and disciplinary based, so it's transdisciplinary. And design here is broadly conceived as intentional or creative ways of bringing about desired change from a given condition. So Frank's Tract Futures is a project. It's for a subsided and inundated tract in the central delta, what you see circled in red here. The levees broke here in the late 30s and then have been unrepaired since. It has developed as a very peculiar tidal lake. It is a state park. It's a little over 3,000 acres. And you can see sort of the urbanized development that's happened along its edge on Bethel Island there. So it has a lot of recreational uses, but for the state, it's quite a problem. One is the sort of novel ecology that's there. There's not really much habitat for native species, particularly the smelt. And the other big problem is it's a source of salinity intrusion into the delta. It makes the delta salty by having this open water body that allows the salty water from the bay to come in, which then makes it really problematic to export water once it's salty. So in this case, the state looked at a potential solution to this. And what you're seeing here was a conceptual draft design put together by some of the state agencies to basically fill up the northwest corner of this tract. That gray brownish color you see would be areas that would be filled up with dredge material or with material from in the tract to create tidal wetlands, bring them back up to the elevation where those would be. And this would do two things. What it does is it plugs the hole where the salinity is coming in, right? So that little nozzle you see is now plugged while creating about a little over 1,000 acres of habitat for smelt and other species, tidal wetland, which is really needed in the area. But there's a problem here. Well, they modeled it, it all worked. It actually met these technical goals in terms of salinity improvement, but this had sort of been developed in a vacuum. And what you see below there are a lot of those communities that this butt right up against didn't really like this solution. And so when it was brought to the public, it was pretty uniformly rejected and hated because it basically would have ruined a lot of the boating navigability in this tract, would have strongly affected the local economy, recreational opportunities, and basically fostered a public around an issue of concern around undesirable change. And so this is where we started the Frank's Track Futures second round of planning of trying to see if we could do something different in terms of collaboration. So this is what the track looks like now. You know, there's all over 130 bass tournaments out here, boating. There's hunting in the fall where you can set up a blind hunt, and you know it has these place-based values. And what we tried to do, this is the result that came out of the Frank's Track Futures project. After about a year and a half of working together, we came up with a solution that not only met the state's two goals of ecology and water quality, but also improved recreation and actually could maybe contribute to the local economy. So this was what we ended up with. I'm going to focus less on the design and again, more focus on some of the process of how we try to undo that first part and find a way to collaborate to make something that was more equitable. And I think a large part of forms of collaborative governance really focus around the forums that are created for that type of participation, which is what I'll try to talk about. So very quickly, we had a interdisciplinary team, a lot of cross-disciplinary knowledge, but our team was rather small compared to a steering committee, which consisted of all the senior agencies responsible for decision-making, funding, implementation, and the like. I don't have time to go through all these folks right now. And an advisory committee. And these are more the stakeholders who would be affected by this design, whether it's the marinas, the local fisher folk, the hunters, the clubs, all these other people who potentially might be affected by the change. And so we brought all of these people together, quite a large group, as you can see, and tried to basically begin by revisiting, what are the objectives of this project? What does everyone want in it? And how do we set those objectives transparently, debate them? How do we measure them? And then how do we work forward iteratively to try to meet them through, trying different alternatives, different types of design with these folks. This is often called structured decision-making, where you kind of are very transparent about how you're working and what you're working towards. And so this resulted in a much more broader suite of goals for the project. Water quality was obviously a key concern of the state. The ecological goals were expanded beyond smelt to include other listed fish, as well as sport fish, as well as waterfowl, so a much broader sense of ecology. And then this middle tier, which was absent in the first round, which was really looking at what this was as a place and for the local economy and those people who live there. So recreation, navigation, local economy, and levee and flood protection. When we started the project at the kickoff meeting, we also asked folks, how do you see this place? What do you value in this tract? How do you use it? How do you inhabit it? So rather than us imposing a map of the landscape, we launched this public survey using some of the technology you can do for this now, where you can do geospatial surveys online, where we ask people, how do you boat in and around the tract? And you can see all the lines there. This is a boating highway. It's focused around the marinas. This is how people get around. We asked where we could put marsh where it wouldn't bother people. We asked them, where do you recreate and what kind of recreation is that? Where do you launch your boat? Where is more public access needed? And perhaps most importantly, we said, where do you think we might improve things from your point of view? Because when we officially first came out here, everybody just said, don't touch anything, we love it. But the more we were out there, the more people talked about things they didn't like shallow water, boating hazards, weeds, things like this. And when people were asked, what they might want to improve, it opened up a conversation where we could really start to talk about that, this tract is changing whether we want it to or not. Climate change, everything, it's a delta. And there's a lot of things that they didn't want to have happen that are, and it really fostered a discussion of how do we collectively want to try to guide change and the design of this tract. So from there, we went through a series of workshops and an iterative design process. And this was over about a year and a half. And I'm just going to show some diagrams of this. Again, we started with our public meeting and a survey of the tract. And then, as was mentioned before, we started with a wide range of options of, how might we design this? How might we arrange these blobs of land that would help meet these goals while also improving things for the local community? So we started off with 6 different options plus the no action alternative. We whittled that down to 3 that were preferred, and then we kept refining these at each iteration based on all the stakeholder input, whether that's from the local recreational community, fish biologists, the hydrodynamic modeling, all of these. So that each time these forms were getting modified. This is a diagram just showing that what you see as these blobs are actually very parametric in shape. They're driven by the hydromodeling, by where recreation should be located, the aspect of the beach, what size those beaches needed to be. So again, each of these was done over an iterative process of trying to define, how these forms might actually meet all of the different stakeholder needs. These are some images from our workshops. And again, these were probably about 6-hour hours meetings where we would come together and work on the design. We'd have trace paper and presentations and things like this. I think what's really important when thinking about collaborative governance is the actual experience, if you will, the aesthetic experience of face-to-face interaction, of working in an environment like this and actually spending time sharing ideas. This is some of our students pinning up some of their design ideas for the recreational features and asking the community, like, what do you like about these? What's working, what's not, and working through that. This is Eli from Department of Water Resources with the tough job of explaining hydrodynamic modeling results to the stakeholders, and the stakeholders giving feedback on that result. So I felt like within each one of these workshops, it was a lot of co-learning where we were learning from the community was learning more about the design process and so forth. Over time, I felt like we developed something together. We ended up with three designs that actually met the state's needs and also were agreeable to the advisory committee, in addition to the no action scenario. And we then put this back out to the public again. We designed another survey and put it online. Now this one, we put the designs in there and we made 3D models that people could fly around through and go and see the different parts of the designs. And then we asked them, to rate them and comment on them. This is one of the designs. The left side is showing what they liked about it. The right side showing what they disliked about it. And then we asked, what do you prefer? The no action alternative, one of the designs. And basically we were really surprised because all of the designs actually rated higher than the no action alternative. Again, we started from a place where everybody said, don't touch anything. And so again, this is that final design. This was the preferred one where you can see how much the land masses have changed. All those areas in green are wetland and upland areas, where it's now in the middle, and there's that open water retained in front of the marinas. There's this second pool of water that creates a lot of nice recreational opportunities. You can see all the recreational features and beaches that have been incorporated. So this was what was preferred out of everything that was on the table. And just in closing, this is some quotes from the final report from this project, which you can find online. Basically what this is saying, and I personally fought very hard to get this into the document, that none of the ideas will go forward unless the recreational and cultural aspects are kept in the design. That is how we kind of all moved forward together and created this collaborative thing. And I think what was amazing about the project is what we ended up with was a design that was far better than what we started with, and that I think exemplifies a multi-benefit adaptation project with community support. But the big question I have here, and maybe this is something we can chat about, is what's next? This project ended a couple of years ago, or a year and a half ago. And as far as I know, nothing's happening. And this is out of my hands. And I'm asked all the time, what's happening with this? Where's it going? And I don't really know because I'm not in government. I'm an academic. And I think this is a question of when we do achieve collaboration with people outside of direct government, what is our response? What is the responsibility of government to those people who've put time into these things and crafted these things to follow through? Or does it mean that, that then puts the onus back on government to find new ways of collaborating across agencies to fund something like this, which meets multiple agency goals rather than one, which requires a lot of creativity and collaboration on their part to maybe make it work. I'll stop there and thank you.
Thanks so much, Brett. Again, a really insightful and illuminating presentation. I'm really struck by the variety of different collaborative processes that we've heard about today, starting with the framing that Andrea provided and then 3 kind of different snapshots into what this could look like in the Delta. I think that your question that you left off with is a good one. And we have about 8 minutes for discussion. I do want to make sure we get to some of the audience questions, but I wonder if you all want to spend a minute talking about that. Where does government pick up where these collaborative processes leave off? What are the connections between these sort of more, perhaps less institutionally formalized or more multi-sectoral processes? How do those then become part of the institution that will create the structure that will allow them to be implemented or put into practice? I'm interested to hear what folks think about that. I'm going to look at Andrea and ask from a research perspective if you have any.
Yeah, no, in short, there's not a lot of good research around this. I really think it's up to this larger collaborative process that's at play to decide which of these things it wants to take up and how it takes it up, right? There's resources, there's time, there's some initiatives that start and go on for a while and then do die, have a purpose, bring people together to talk in a certain way, and then kind of fade away. If you just look at the history of collaboration in the Bay Delta, I think the modern goes back to an EPA initiative, and it started bringing people together and in certain forums to talk a certain way. That kind of went away because funding and leadership faded, and then it moved into something else. So I kind of see it as an evolution and learning and change over time. And maybe it isn't so much about maintaining all of them, all of the specific processes or embedding them. Maybe there are these different kind of streams or ebbs and flows that happen over time. And if we think about them as all processes that allow folks to come together and learn, maybe that's okay.
Yeah, that resonates for me, at least. I think that makes sense, that there wouldn't be one centralized channel. And it's just a matter of, coming back to kind of an adaptive approach. We learn, and we update. Jessica, from your experience, what would you say? Do you have any trouble finding ways to make collaboration stick? Or do you have any experience navigating that? Oh, I think we're having trouble with your sound.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me now? Okay, cool. Sorry, the internet was getting unstable. So I was actually thinking about the last question, which is, where does this all come together? And I've been thinking about this a lot with the Water Forum. It's an organization that's been around for 20 years. Clearly, I'm new. We've got a bunch of new staff. We're kind of reinventing the program in a way, but at the same time, trying to hold true to the work that we have been doing, which is really the scientific and technical work around a flow management standard, and then all the habitat enhancement work. But I think one of the, and I don't know if we figured this out yet, but there's a graceful way, I think, to take all of the regulatory requirements and programs and influences, whether that's legislation like CVPIA or processes like the statewide VA process, and say, when you pull all of these together, the intent of these programs and the intent of the legislation, this is what it looks like, and this is how it's actually implemented. Somebody asked a question about the VAs, and I think the VAs, there was a big announcement that came out last week or 2 weeks ago about those programs, and the Water Forum is really envisioned as the implementing organization for the American River region. And it's very much the Water Forum as structured now. And obviously we will need to change some things, and our financial structure would change if this is all implemented. But I think overall, you want to have partners like that, or sort of local organizations where they can adapt to the new regulations and new information that's coming out and really kind of integrate it all. So that's how I'm starting to think about it.
Thanks, Jessica. I want to switch gears a little bit because we've had a few questions to the panelists come in about tribal consultation on both for you, Jessica, at the Water Forum, and Brett on Frank's Tract. And Matt, I'm also interested to hear your experience. Did you engage with either of those processes? And then just overall, I'd be curious to hear reflections from all of you about best practices and ways to increase and really enhance the value of collaborations between tribal and non-tribal groups. Matt, do you want to open us up on that one?
Sure. Yeah, that one, I think when it comes to, I think for us historically, we've kind of come into some of these discussions, say midstream. Oftentimes we don't get the initial consultation, but somehow through the process we do get involved. Which has been difficult for us because it's at that point you're kind of playing catch up instead of getting ahead of the issues. Then it kind of goes back to that collaboration, I guess, instead of that consultation mindset where it's purely regulatory. And I think that's where we kind of come into situations where their policies or regulations are so set that they're not willing to adapt, I guess, or adjust to accommodate how they work with tribes. Like I mentioned at the beginning, each tribe is a little bit different in how they operate, and you might see one tribe much more responsive versus another. And a lot of those tribes kind of slip through the cracks. And when agencies say put out a notification of intent, or they have something in the plans where they at some point need to consult with tribes, but oftentimes they're not available or responsive. And that gets seen upon and counted as consultation. And for us, consultation has to be something that is agreed upon. I guess at that point forward, oftentimes we'll meet as an agency to another agency, but we'll state that this isn't consultation. This is purely informational, for instance. Until we kind of get into the bandwidth where, okay, we're ready to consult now, and we can move forward, hopefully. But I think it's just that, yeah, we really need to find ways to relax, I guess, on some of the more rigid policies and regulations that have been maybe put in place decades ago, and now we're finding that they're really obsolete, and the way we consult now versus then is completely different. So things need to reflect that, I believe. And I think what you'll find, at least with our tribe, is we do get heavily involved at the legislative levels, and sometimes it takes a bill to change things, and we've done that. But it takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of money. And even then, you still might have resistance from agencies because it's a change. And, you know, we don't really like change too much when it comes to these things because we get set in our ways. But I think over time, you really need to be flexible with tribes, I guess, because a lot of our values do not line up with how things are structured nowadays, governmentally speaking.
Great, thanks, Matt. That's really helpful advice, speaking from experience. I'm wondering if we are at 1 o'clock, so certainly understand if folks need to log off, but if y'all are available to stay on for just a couple minutes, maybe we can finish up with this question. Brett and Jessica, if you wanted to talk about how tribes engage. Brett, go ahead.
Yeah, I think there was a question there about there wasn't a lot of tribal representation in Frank's tract. Absolutely true. We did try to reach out. It was not at the beginning, which is also a fault. And we had trouble getting participation, and that is a limitation of that project, and I appreciate it being pointed out. I can say, so I can't, that was a problem with that project. I would say that I'm now working on another one in the same region of the Delta. It's called Delta Island Adaptations, and we are taking a different approach. And right from the get-go, we have two indigenous tribal members from the Delta on our advisory board, and they, right from the start, trying to see how we can think about co-management. And I mean, I find it's very challenging to try to make sure that when you do this work that you don't end up repeating colonial legacies, or making sure that it's mutually beneficial, that you're not trying to just enroll people that then it's still exploitive, but really we're trying to make sure that it is in their benefit. And, you know, a lot of what Matt was bringing up, like access to basket weaving materials, of the opportunity to perform some forms of stewardship that used to be done in the Delta, like burning. Like burning has gone away in the Delta, and the marshes used to be burned. So we are looking at that and trying to find ways to integrate that. And I'd also say what's been really interesting of working with Dawn and Austin, our two people who are helping us, is that it's really affected how we think about all of our objectives, because it's coming at things from a very different way, cosmology, whatever you want to call that, just a whole different approach to the landscapes of the Delta, which has then informed how we're thinking about all of that. So it's definitely a big learning process for me. And yeah, that's what I'd say.
Thanks, Brett. Yeah, learning and adapting, right? Jessica, did you want to speak briefly about the Water Forum and tribal engagement?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think, you know, Matthew, you've clearly outlined that there's a huge gap in not just consultation, but really engagement with tribal communities. I'm really seeing this a lot at the Water Forum. The American River, the Lower American River, the Parkway was and is still a place of, you know, Native people's sort of cultural aesthetic. I mean, there's so much there, and we can't, you know, the projects that we're doing are mostly in the river. They're not sort of in upland areas where there might be cultural resources, but still the work that we're doing is really, I think there's a lot of opportunity to integrate the restoration and habitat enhancement work that we're doing with tribal perspectives in mind. And so in terms of process, always coming back to process, the Water Forum, when it started back in the 90s and signed in 2000, it had 4 caucuses: water, environment, business, and then civic, or sort of public, which was much more of, you know, the Taxpayers Association and the League of Women Voters. As we're renegotiating the agreement, Water Forum 2.0, we've reformed a public caucus and have had a lot of internal conversations about what would it look like to bring in either a tribal caucus or sort of an outside government group. Anyways, I think there's areas to explore there. And Matt, I'm glad we're on this panel together, because I'm going to follow up with you. And, you know, for me, we had just sort of a short story from last year. At the Ansel Hoffman Project, we had, we were doing a tremendous amount of work out there, and we had the traditional ecological knowledge group from the Shingle Springs Band of Miwok Indians. They came out to the site and visited, and we walked the site, talked about the restoration project that was happening, and it was an amazing dialogue. And since then, the woman who is in charge of that group, Crystal Moreno, we've been talking a little bit more just about, she was just talking about fisheries monitoring and the work that her group is doing to monitor fisheries conditions. And so we were just exchanging, well, we're doing a ton of that as well. And hey, how about you come and join this stakeholder group that meets on a monthly basis? It's called the American River Group, ARG, and it's a stakeholder group where state, federal agencies, Water Forum members can get together and we talk about what's happening on the river, what the conditions are, what the release projections are going to be for that month. And so, I haven't followed up with her since she started attending the meetings, but I think I'd be really curious to hear what her experience is in that and whether or not that, she feels like that's a good opportunity to ask questions or to engage. But yeah, there's just a tremendous amount of opportunity here. So thanks for following through on this. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. And just maybe in 1 minute, Andrea, from a research perspective, I'm curious to hear what the social scientific literature.
Look, most of the research, there's a lot of research on this, and most of the research is about how people didn't get it right, how we didn't engage tribal communities, indigenous communities, minority communities in good ways. So most of the scholarship is about how we've gotten this wrong. You could flip that and then say, this is what we got wrong. This is kind of how you change it, or this is what this would look like. So if you think about best practices or process, people talk about, of course, who's at the table, but they talk about how not all the heterogeneity of tribal communities. There's not one seat for one tribal person, but there's this recognition that there's diverse communities, different interests, different ways of using water, different experiences. And so recognizing that heterogeneity, it's simple things. It's about how, not simple, but things we don't think about. Sometimes you think if you have somebody at the table, check, it's done, but how you build an agenda and what that looks like, and the content of it and the flow and how people talk, the language that you use, all of that can be inclusive to diverse kinds of people or not, or it can be more closed off. Most of what I've read, and people spoke about it here, is it's about engaging with tribes and different communities at the very beginning. It's not about bringing folks in later. And it's about asking tribes and tribal members and representatives of how they want to be engaged. It's not presupposing, our usual set of how we go about doing this, but it's really sitting down and having those really rich conversations about how people want to be engaged. There's really a great scholarship around justice, environmental justice, that's really evolved. So we know that it's about process and procedures, right? How you bring people together. We know it's about like how we distribute goods and benefits, like who wins and who loses. You can look at water and resources. But over the last number of years, people have been talking about recognition and rights. And it's for tribal communities in the US, it's about tribal sovereignty. It's seeing tribes as, government entities equal to all of these other entities. And it's recognizing those rights, and it's having conversations and processes that really, frankly, are really different. It's not just about bringing the tribes to the table. It's like rethinking about what that table looks like and how we do our processes. And I don't think we really have that. There's not good best practices because we don't really do this really well. And we need to be thinking about how to do better. And that needs to be in conversation with tribes about how they want to be having these conversations.
Thank you so much. I really hate to cut off this conversation, but we are over time, and I'm so grateful to all of you for staying on, and to everybody who's still listening. I think that this was a really important conversation to have, and here's to reshaping that table, right? But yeah, thank you all so much. This was a really energizing conversation for me, and just extremely informative. I really can't thank our presenters enough for being here today, and everybody who attended. I put the registration link in the chat. Our next webinar, our final webinar on adaptive governance, will be on May 5th. So please do register and tune in for that one. And the recording for this webinar will be available probably in the next week or so. So thank you again. I hope everybody has a wonderful day, and we look forward to seeing you next month. Take care.
Have a nice day.
You too. Thanks, Matt.